Imagine being thousands of miles away from home, surrounded by chaos, gunfire, fear, and uncertainty. Not knowing if you'll survive the next hour and then being handed a meal that barely looks edible. No warm kitchen, no comforting smell. Just survival. This is not a movie scene. This was real life for American soldiers during World War II. The food they ate wasn't about taste, comfort, or choice. It was about staying alive one more day. And some of these meals were so shocking, so desperate, that even today they leave historians stunned. World War II wasn't just fought with bullets and bombs. It was fought with stomachs growling in trenches, with exhausted hands opening metal cans in freezing rain, and with soldiers forcing themselves to swallow food they hated because hunger was a more dangerous enemy than fear. Many people imagine heroic battles and dramatic victories, but very few talk about what soldiers actually ate while fighting one of the deadliest wars in human history. The truth is uncomfortable, raw, and deeply emotional. American soldiers came from homes where meals meant warmth, family, and comfort. Suddenly, they were eating under fire, in jungles, deserts, and frozen forests. There were days when rations were delayed, days when supply lines were cut, days when soldiers had to eat whatever they could find or not eat at all. Hunger became constant. Food became fuel, not pleasure. And sometimes, that fuel came in forms that still shock people today. One of the most common meals American soldiers were forced to eat was something called hardtack. It looked like a brick. It tasted like nothing, or worse. Hardtack was so hard that soldiers joked it could break teeth. It was made to last forever, not to taste good. Many soldiers soaked it in water, coffee, or even soup, just to make it chewable. Some cracked it with rifle butts. Others smashed it on rocks. It was often infested with bugs, and soldiers had to decide whether to knock the insects out or eat them for extra protein. When hunger was extreme, no one complained. Another shocking reality was canned meat. Soldiers received tins of processed meat that had been sealed months or even years earlier. The most infamous was Spam. While some soldiers eventually learned to cook it creatively, many hated it. Cold Spam, greasy Spam, rubbery Spam, sometimes eaten straight from the can in the mud. In extreme conditions, Spam became both a joke and a nightmare. Yet it was protein, and protein meant strength. In some areas, soldiers were issued powdered eggs. Mixed with water, these eggs turned into a strange yellow paste that smelled unpleasant and tasted worse. Many soldiers gagged while eating them. But refusing food was not an option. The body needed calories. Every bite mattered. Soldiers learned to swallow quickly and not think about flavor. Chocolate might sound comforting, but even that was different in World War II. The U.S. military designed chocolate bars that would not melt in heat. The result, a rock-hard, bitter chocolate ration that soldiers hated. It was intentionally made unappetizing so soldiers wouldn't eat it unless absolutely necessary. Some soldiers described it as tasting like boiled potatoes mixed with cocoa. Yet in moments of extreme hunger, that bitter chocolate could mean the difference between collapse and survival. In freezing European winters, soldiers sometimes received lukewarm soup that had traveled for hours before reaching them. By the time it arrived, it was barely warm and often filled with grit or dirt from the battlefield. Soldiers ate it anyway, crouched behind cover, knowing a hot meal might not come again for days. Warmth mattered. Calories mattered. Pride did not. In the Pacific, American soldiers faced a completely different nightmare. Jungle warfare meant humidity, insects, rot, and disease. Food spoiled quickly. Cans rusted. Fresh supplies were rare. Soldiers sometimes ate rice crawling with insects, brushing bugs away with their fingers before forcing each bite down. In desperation, some soldiers roasted insects or scavenged local plants, unsure if they were safe. Hunger overpowered fear. One of the most disturbing meals involved emergency survival rations. These were designed for soldiers who were trapped, lost, or cut off. They were small, dense, and barely edible. No seasoning, no comfort, just compressed calories. Soldiers often described them as tasting like sawdust or cardboard. But in moments of crisis, those rations were life itself. There were times when American soldiers were forced to eat cold meals for weeks. No fire allowed, because smoke could reveal their position. No cooking, no warmth, just cold, canned food, eaten silently in the dark. Imagine opening a can with numb fingers, listening for enemy movement, heart pounding, knowing this might be your last meal. Food also became psychological warfare. Morale dropped when rations were bad. Soldiers dreamed of home-cooked meals. They talked about burgers, pies, coffee, and fresh bread. Some even wrote letters describing food more than the war itself. Hunger made everything harder, fear sharper, exhaustion deeper. In some extreme situations, soldiers scavenged abandoned enemy supplies or local food sources. This was risky. Food could be contaminated or poisoned. But starvation left no choices. Soldiers cooked whatever they could find, sometimes using helmets as pots. The smell of burning food mixed with gunpowder and fear. Coffee became sacred, even bad coffee, even burnt coffee. It gave warmth, comfort, and a sense of normalcy. Soldiers drank it whenever possible, sometimes reusing coffee grounds again and again. A cup of coffee could feel like hope. One of the most shocking facts is that many soldiers lost significant weight during the war, not because food didn't exist, but because access was unreliable. Supply trucks were destroyed, planes were shot down, ships were sunk. When food didn't arrive, soldiers endured hunger quietly, knowing complaining wouldn't change reality. Meals were eaten fast, no table, no plates, no forks sometimes. Just hands, cans, and urgency. Eating slowly was dangerous. You never knew when you'd have to run, hide, or fight. Food became something you grabbed, swallowed, and forgot until hunger returned. Yet, despite all this, soldiers survived. They adapted. They joked about horrible meals. They shared what little they had. Food became a bond, a reminder of humanity in inhuman conditions. The smell alone made stomachs turn, yet hunger forced them to eat anyway. Vomiting after meals was common, but refusing food was worse. One of the most shocking meals came in the form of canned stews that had been overheated under the sun for days. It never did, but calories mattered more than comfort. Processed cheese blocks that melted in heat and hardened again into oily bricks. In cold climates, they froze solid. Soldiers gnawed at them like animals. Some joked it could stop bullets. If it didn't kill you immediately, it was considered safe enough. Some soldiers experienced days where the only food available was crackers and water. Crackers so dry they absorbed moisture from the mouth. Lips cracked, throats burned. Still, they chewed slowly, knowing there might be nothing tomorrow. During intense battles, soldiers often skipped meals entirely. Adrenaline replaced hunger. But once fighting slowed, the hunger hit harder than ever. Men shook from weakness. Heads spun. Some soldiers fainted simply from lack of food. One of the least talked about realities was how food affected mental health. Soldiers became irritable, depressed, and emotionally numb. They dreamed of food. They talked about recipes instead of plans. Hunger became a constant background noise in their minds. There were moments when soldiers ate food they had never seen before, unsure if it was edible, but trusting instinct and desperation. Sometimes raw. On paper, they were balanced. In reality, they were repetitive and dull. Eating the same bland food every day crushed morale. Soldiers traded items, saved the least offensive parts, and threw away what they couldn't stand when they had the luxury to do so. Cigarettes were included in rations and often traded for food. Hunger made soldiers value calories over everything else. Some gave up personal items just for an extra bite. There were moments when American soldiers captured enemy food supplies. This felt like a miracle. Fresh bread, hot soup, proper meals. But even this was dangerous. Fear of poisoning was real. Soldiers debated whether to risk it. Sometimes hunger won. One soldier described eating bread that was still warm from an enemy kitchen. He cried while eating, not from joy, but from exhaustion and disbelief. That memory stayed with him longer than any battle. In winter conditions, frozen food was common. Cans had to be heated just to open. Fingers went numb. Lips stuck to metal. Soldiers burned precious fuel just to make food chewable. The emotional weight of eating alone, far from home, cannot be overstated. Meals were reminders of families, kitchens, and peace. Every bad meal emphasized how far soldiers were from normal life. Some soldiers developed tricks to survive. Mixing foods together, heating cans in engine blocks, crushing crackers into soups. Creativity became survival. Despite the misery, soldiers bonded over food complaints. Shared suffering built friendships. Laughing about horrible meals was a coping mechanism. Humor became seasoning. There were times when soldiers were so hungry they ate without tasting, shoveling food into mouths mechanically, later realizing they had no memory of the meal at all. By the middle of the war, hunger was no longer just discomfort. It became a threat as real as enemy fire. American soldiers began to realize that food could decide who lived and who collapsed on the battlefield. The meals they were forced to eat now crossed a line from unpleasant to deeply disturbing, and many veterans later admitted they never spoke about these moments because words couldn't fully capture the desperation. In isolated combat zones, supply drops sometimes missed their targets or landed in enemy territory. When that happened, soldiers were left with nothing. Days passed without proper meals. Men grew weak, dizzy, and confused. Some soldiers chewed on grass or tree bark just to keep their mouths busy. Hunger plays tricks on the mind, and many described seeing food where none existed. One of the most shocking realities was the consumption of food meant for animals. In desperate moments, American soldiers ate horse feed, livestock grain, and even dog food when they could find it. These were never intended for humans, but starvation erased that boundary. The taste was awful, the texture rough, but it filled the stomach temporarily. In some areas of Europe, American soldiers encountered abandoned farms. The food left behind was often spoiled or contaminated. Still, soldiers scavenged what they could. Moldy bread had the mold scraped off. Rotten vegetables were cut down to what looked safe. Hunger made judgment blurry. There were times when soldiers boiled leather from boots or equipment just to extract something chewable. The result was flavorless, rubbery strips that provided almost no nutrition, but psychologically, eating something felt better than eating nothing. In prisoner recovery missions, some American soldiers witnessed what true starvation looked like, and it terrified them. Seeing others reduced to skeletal forms made them realize how close they themselves were to that edge. After those experiences, soldiers ate anything without hesitation. One disturbing meal involved emergency survival meat bars. Dense, greasy, and nearly inedible. They were designed to keep soldiers alive, not satisfied. Many described them as smelling rancid even when sealed. Soldiers forced them down, often gagging, knowing refusal meant weakness. In the Pacific Theater, soldiers sometimes ate partially spoiled fish because it was the only protein available. The smell was overpowering. The risk of illness was high, but hunger always won. In jungle environments, insects were everywhere. Some soldiers brushed them away, others didn't bother. Protein was protein. Ants, beetles, and larvae were swallowed along with rice or roots. Many soldiers later admitted this was one of the hardest mental barriers they had to cross. There were moments when American soldiers cooked food using explosives heat, carefully warming cans near burning debris. This was dangerous but necessary. The fear of hunger outweighed the fear of injury. Another shocking aspect was how quickly soldiers adapted. Things that once made them sick became normal. Disgust faded. Survival instincts took over. The body demanded fuel, and the mind obeyed. Rations sometimes arrived damaged, leaking, rusted, or bloated. These were signs the food was unsafe. But throwing it away meant nothing to eat. Soldiers smelled it, hesitated, then ate it anyway. Some got sick, some didn't. It was a gamble they took daily. In extreme cold, frozen meat was sometimes eaten raw because cooking was impossible. Chewing took effort. Teeth ached, but energy was needed to stay warm. Food theft became a silent issue, not out of greed, but desperation. Soldiers stole from abandoned kitchens, from supply dumps, even from fellow soldiers. Guilt followed, but hunger didn't care about morals. One soldier later described eating a meal while shaking uncontrollably, not from fear, but from lack of food. His hands could barely hold the can. That memory haunted him more than combat. During long marches, soldiers burned thousands of calories with little intake. Weight loss was severe. Uniforms hung loose. Faces grew hollow. Hunger aged men quickly. There were nights when soldiers dreamed of food so vividly that waking up felt cruel. The taste lingered, only to disappear when reality returned. Food shortages also affected combat effectiveness. Weak soldiers moved slower, thought processes dulled. Leaders worried more about feeding men than advancing lines. In some areas, American soldiers shared meals with local civilians. The civilians had even less. Watching children eat scraps changed how soldiers viewed hunger forever. Some gave away their own rations, choosing hunger over guilt. Perhaps the most disturbing meals were the ones eaten in silence. No jokes, no complaints, just men chewing slowly, eyes empty, knowing this was war's true cost. By now, food was no longer food. It was survival math, calories in versus energy out. Every bite counted. Every missed meal was dangerous. And yet, the worst meals, the ones soldiers remembered for the rest of their lives, were still ahead. Meals that pushed human endurance to its limits and forced choices no one should ever have to make. By the final years of the war, food had lost all meaning except survival. American soldiers were no longer shocked by bad meals, they expected them. What shocked them now was when food actually tasted normal. Hunger had rewired their minds. Anything warm, anything chewable, anything that stayed down was considered a victory. In prolonged battles, soldiers went days with almost nothing. When rations finally arrived, they were often incomplete, missing items, crushed cans, broken seals. Soldiers didn't complain. They divided what they had and moved on. The body learned to function on less, but the cost was visible. Sunken eyes, weak legs, trembling hands. One of the most disturbing meals came during encirclement situations, when American units were cut off completely. With no supply lines, soldiers relied entirely on what they carried. Once that ran out, the choices became unthinkable. Soldiers slaughtered pack animals meant for transport. The meat was tough, improperly cooked, sometimes eaten raw, but it kept men alive. In ruined cities, soldiers searched destroyed buildings for anything edible. flour covered in dust, sugar mixed with debris. Even burnt food scraps were collected. Hunger erased disgust. Anything that once fed a human was considered food again. Some soldiers admitted eating food that smelled so bad they had to hold their breath while chewing. The stomach rejected it, but they forced it back down. Hunger made vomiting feel like failure. In extreme cases, soldiers drank broth made from boiled bones left behind in rubble. The nutritional value was minimal, but psychologically, it felt like a meal. Warm liquid meant comfort, even briefly. Food poisoning was common. Diarrhea weakened already exhausted men. Yet soldiers continued eating questionable food because weakness from hunger was worse than sickness. The fear of starvation became constant. Even when food was available, soldiers ate faster than necessary, afraid it might disappear. Plates were scraped clean. Crumbs mattered. There were moments when soldiers found abandoned bakeries or kitchens. These moments felt unreal. Men ate until they couldn't move, knowing it might be the last real meal for weeks. Some cried while eating, overwhelmed by relief. In the Pacific, American soldiers sometimes relied on captured enemy rice supplies. The rice was often moldy or insect-filled. Soldiers washed it repeatedly, then cooked it into thick paste. Taste no longer mattered. Water shortages made food even harder to swallow. Dry rations without water felt like punishment. Soldiers rationed sips carefully, sometimes choosing thirst over hunger. As the war dragged on, even morale foods lost effect. Candy tasted dull. Chocolate felt like wax. Hunger changed taste itself. Some soldiers chewed gum not for flavor, but to trick their stomachs into thinking food was coming. It worked briefly. The emotional impact of constant hunger followed soldiers long after the war. Many veterans later said they could never waste food again. Plates had to be clean. Full stomachs felt unreal. One soldier described eating a meal so bad he promised himself he would remember it forever, just to prove he survived it. That promise stayed with him for life. Food became memory. Each terrible meal marked a moment of endurance, a reminder of how close they came to breaking. In some units, soldiers shared stories of home meals like myths, Thanksgiving dinners, fresh bread, hot coffee. These conversations kept hope alive. The closer the war came to its end, the more exhausted everyone became. Hunger layered on top of trauma, fear, and loss. Bodies were running on fumes. Yet even in these conditions, soldiers kept going. They fought, they marched, they survived on meals that history rarely mentions. And then came the final phase, the meals eaten at the edge of victory. Meals that should have tasted sweet, but instead tasted like survival itself. As the war finally moved toward its end, American soldiers expected relief, but hunger did not disappear overnight. Even in victory, food remained uncertain. Supply lines were damaged, infrastructure was destroyed. Soldiers often ate the same brutal meals right up until the final days. The irony was painful surviving the war, yet still fighting hunger. Some of the last meals eaten before liberation were the hardest to forget. Soldiers who had imagined celebration instead chewed cold rations in silence. Victory felt distant when the stomach was empty. Many later said that hunger made it impossible to feel joy immediately. In liberated towns, civilians shared what little they had. These meals were humble thin soups, stale bread, weak tea, but they were offered with gratitude. Soldiers ate slowly, aware that the people feeding them had even less. These moments left deeper emotional scars than combat. One of the most haunting realities was seeing enemy soldiers surrender due to starvation. Hunger did not choose sides. American soldiers recognized the same hollow eyes, the same shaking hands. In those moments, food became a symbol of shared humanity rather than war. When proper meals finally returned, many soldiers couldn't eat normally. Stomachs had shrunk. Rich food caused pain. Some soldiers felt sick after eating full meals. Hunger had changed their bodies permanently. There were soldiers who hid food even when supplies improved. Fear of starvation lingered. Bread saved in pockets. Cans tucked away. Hunger teaches habits that are hard to erase. One soldier recalled eating his first real meal after the war ended and feeling overwhelmed not with happiness, but with sadness. He realized how much of himself he had lost just trying to stay alive. Food memories followed soldiers home. Ordinary meals triggered flashbacks. The smell of canned meat, the sound of opening tins. Some veterans avoided certain foods for the rest of their lives. Families noticed strange behaviors. Plates cleaned completely. Food eaten too fast. Panic when supplies ran low. Hunger had left invisible wounds. Many veterans later said the worst part of the war wasn't battle, it was the constant, gnawing hunger that never let them rest. Hunger made fear sharper. Cold colder. Colder. Loneliness deeper. History books celebrate victories, strategies, and heroes, but they rarely mention the meals eaten in mud, darkness, and fear. The meals that kept men alive just long enough to survive another day. Those shocking meals were not just food, they were endurance tests. Every forced bite was an act of resistance. Every swallowed mouthful was survival. The true cost of war can be measured not just in lives lost, but in how low human beings were pushed just to stay alive. American soldiers didn't just fight enemies, they fought hunger itself. These meals changed how soldiers viewed comfort forever. A simple piece of bread became sacred. Warm food became a miracle. Even decades later, many veterans could describe these meals in detail: the taste, the smell, the moment. Hunger burns memories deeper than fear. And that is why these shocking World War II meals matter. Not for curiosity alone, but to understand the human price of war. To remember that survival often depends on the most basic need of all. The next time food is wasted or taken for granted, remember the soldiers who were forced to eat whatever they could find, not for pleasure, not for choice, but for survival. This is the story history doesn't like to tell, but it's the truth. If you want more real stories history forgot, visit the channel and watch the next video because some stories are too real to ignore.